It was supposed to be a routine stop. At least, that's what the officer claimed. A black man in an expensive suit steps out of his car, calm and composed, but the officer's hostility is immediate. Without cause, he cuffs the man, throws him into the back of his cruiser, and smugly mutters, "Let's see how you like explaining this in court." But as the courtroom doors swing open, the officer's cocky smirk vanishes. The man he just humiliated is now walking to the front, not as the accused, but as the federal prosecutor about to take him down. And that's when the real story begins. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. The officer didn't notice much about the man he pulled over, except for his skin color. Derek Lawson wasn't your average driver, though. He was a man who moved through the world with quiet confidence, the kind that unsettles those who rely on fear to maintain control. A tailored navy suit clung to his broad shoulders, and his polished shoes reflected the sunlight as he stepped out of his sleek black sedan. Derek wasn't just a man of means, he was a man of purpose. Years spent navigating courtrooms had taught him patience, but the fire in his eyes hinted at something deeper. This was a man who'd faced prejudice before, and conquered it every single time. But on this particular day, Derek's calm demeanor would be tested in ways even he didn't expect. As the officer barked orders and tightened the cuffs on his wrists, Derek said nothing. His silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. Because Derek Lawson wasn't just another man pulled over on the side of the road. He was a federal prosecutor with a reputation for dismantling corruption, and he was about to face one of his most personal battles yet. "Step out of the car," the officer barked, his tone dripping with authority and disdain. Derek did as he was told, moving slowly, his hands raised, his expression unreadable. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked calmly, but his measured tone only seemed to irritate the cop further. The officer glanced at the luxury car, then back at Derek, eyes narrowing. "You people think you can just drive around like you own the place," he muttered almost under his breath. "License and registration." Derek handed over the documents, but the officer barely glanced at them before tossing them aside. "This car looks stolen," he said flatly. "Turn around." Before Derek could respond, his hands were wrenched behind his back and cold steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. The few bystanders nearby watched in stunned silence, some recording the scene with their phones. "This is unnecessary," Derek said, his voice still even but firmer now. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Save it for the judge," the officer sneered, shoving Derek into the back seat of the patrol car. As they drove to the station, Derek stared out the window, his jaw clenched. He wasn't angry about the arrest, he was angry about what it represented. By the time they reached the station, the officer was already spinning his version of events, confident he had just another nobody in custody. But Derek wasn't about to let this end here, and as he was led into the holding cell, a plan was already forming in his mind. The courtroom was bustling when Derek Lawson was escorted inside, still in cuffs. Lawyers shuffled papers, the judge adjusted her robe, and the officer stood at the prosecution's table with a smug grin, confident his arrest would stick. Derek scanned the room with sharp, calculating eyes, noting every detail, the officer's posture, the judge's demeanor, and the murmurs among the lawyers. When the clerk called the case, Derek did something unexpected. He calmly stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, "Your Honor, before this proceeding begins, I'd like to clarify something." The judge raised an eyebrow, curious. The officer, on the other hand, was visibly annoyed. "Sit down," he hissed, but Derek didn't flinch. He looked directly at the judge, his tone steady but commanding. "I am Derek Lawson, federal prosecutor for the Eastern District. And, as of this moment, I am no longer the accused. I am here to file charges against Officer Jenkins for false arrest and abuse of power." The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned to the officer, whose smug confidence crumbled in an instant. He stammered, What are you talking about?" Derek turned to face him, his expression unyielding. "You made a mistake, officer," he said firmly. "A very big mistake." The officer's face flushed with panic, but Derek wasn't finished. He stepped toward the bench, producing his badge and credentials from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that this case proceed immediately, under the correct charges." The room erupted in whispers, and the officer's jaw dropped. Derek wasn't just fighting for himself, he was about to expose a system that thrived on prejudice and unchecked power. The real battle was only beginning. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the murmurs that filled the courtroom. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice firm but curious, "you claim misconduct by this officer. Do you have evidence to support these charges?" Derek nodded, his calm exterior masking the fire burning inside him. "Your Honor, I request permission to subpoena traffic stop footage and records of Officer Jenkins' prior arrests. I believe they will reveal a pattern of racial profiling and abuse of authority." The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Granted," she said, her tone decisive. "This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. with the requested evidence." As Derek walked out of the courtroom, the weight of his decision bore down on him. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about shining a light on a system that thrived on silence. He spent the evening poring over case files, reviewing his own legal victories, and strategizing how to present this case not just as a defense, but as an indictment of systemic injustice. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, community leaders, and even off-duty officers filled the seats. Derek stood at the front, a commanding figure, as the court clerk handed him a folder containing the evidence he'd requested. He began with the footage. As it played on the screen, the room watched in stunned silence. The video showed the officer pulling Derek over, his tone hostile from the start. Then came the damning words. "You people think you can just drive around like you own the place." Murmurs rippled through the room, but Derek wasn't done. "Your Honor," he said, pointing to a printed chart, "this is a record of Officer Jenkins' traffic stops over the past year. Over 70% of the individuals he arrested were black, despite black residents making up only 15% of the population in his patrol area." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his smug demeanor replaced by visible panic. Derek continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person this officer has wrongfully targeted, every life disrupted by his unchecked bias." The tension in the room was electric. Even the judge looked shaken, her pen tapping anxiously against the desk. "And, Your Honor," Derek added, stepping closer to the bench, "this pattern of behavior isn't unique to Officer Jenkins. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one we can no longer ignore." The officer's attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. The evidence was irrefutable, and Derek's words had ignited something in the room. People were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a turning point. And as Derek prepared to make his final argument, the air buzzed with anticipation. The climax was near, and everyone could feel it. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on Derek as he stepped to the center, his voice steady yet charged with emotion. "Your Honor," he began, holding up another document, "I've obtained one final piece of evidence, an internal memo from Officer Jenkins' precinct detailing complaints filed against him for misconduct." The judge's brow furrowed, and the officer's face drained of color. Derek unfolded the document slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "This memo shows that at least 8 formal complaints were lodged against Officer Jenkins in the last 2 years, complaints that were dismissed without investigation." Gasps echoed through the room. The officer's attorney stood abruptly. "Objection. This is hearsay." "Overruled," the judge interjected sharply, her patience thinning. "Mr. Lawson, continue." Derek turned to the gallery, his voice rising. "This officer has been allowed to abuse his badge, targeting individuals based on the color of their skin, while the system protected him. But today, that ends. He shifted his focus to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. What you've seen here is not just one man's prejudice, it's a failure of accountability. It's a system that has allowed this behavior to flourish, unchecked, and it's people like Officer Jenkins who make a mockery of the oath to serve and protect. Then came the moment no one expected. Derek reached into his briefcase and pulled out a signed affidavit. "This," he said, holding it high, "is a statement from another officer in Jenkins' precinct, an officer who witnessed his behavior and finally had the courage to speak up." He read the statement aloud. "I have personally observed Officer Jenkins falsify reports, escalate unnecessary conflicts, and use racially charged language during arrests." The officer bolted upright, his face red with anger. "This is a setup," he shouted. "Sit down, Officer Jenkins," the judge commanded, her tone icy. The room buzzed with tension as Derek delivered the final blow. "Your Honor, I'm requesting that Officer Jenkins not only be held accountable for his actions against me, but also face a full investigation for the misconduct outlined here." The judge's gavel struck the bench. "Request granted," she said, her voice firm. "Officer Jenkins, you are hereby suspended pending investigation, and this court will move forward with Mr. Lawson's charges against you." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the officer slumping into his chair, his smug facade shattered. Derek stood tall, his eyes unwavering as the weight of the moment settled over everyone in the room. But this wasn't the end. Derek knew there was still one more chapter to write. The resolution was coming, and it would leave no doubt about the power of integrity and justice. The courtroom emptied slowly, whispers filling the air as people left, their faces reflecting the weight of what they had just witnessed. Derek remained seated, watching as Officer Jenkins was escorted out, no longer a figure of authority but a man facing the consequences of his actions. As Derek gathered his belongings, a young black woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up, for all of us." Derek offered her a kind smile, the weight of her words settling over him like a quiet victory. The news of the trial spread quickly. Headlines highlighted the fall of a corrupt officer and praised Derek's unwavering resolve. But Derek wasn't interested in fame. His focus remained on what mattered: justice, accountability, and change. Days later, Derek stood at a community gathering, addressing a crowd of people who had come to hear his story. "This wasn't just about me," he began, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "This was about a system that needs to do better, about making sure that no one feels like their voice doesn't matter." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, many of them reflecting the same struggles he had faced. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we can hold people accountable. We can stand together, and we can demand that justice is not just a word, but a reality for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, not just for Derek's words, but for the hope he represented. As he walked off the stage, Derek felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. He knew the road ahead would be long, but this victory was proof that integrity and resilience could turn the tide. The story of Derek Lawson wasn't just one man's fight against injustice. It was a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. And the morale was clear. No matter how underestimated or overlooked you might feel, truth and justice have a way of rising to the surface. When you stand for what's right, even against overwhelming odds, you don't just fight for yourself, you fight for everyone who needs a voice. And in the end, that's how real change begins. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness, one act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.